The wrong species was woken by alien war crimes. Part 1. The Silence Before the Fire. The year was 2038, and the galaxy was a very old and crowded place. It held hundreds of species, thousands of worlds, and more history than any human could read in a lifetime. The Galactic Conclave was the center of it all, a vast political body that brought together every known intelligent species under one set of laws and one shared table. Humanity had joined it 80 years ago, not arriving with trade ships, scientists, and diplomats who smiled a lot and talked carefully. Most of the elder species of the Conclave found humans interesting the way one finds a young child interesting. Harmless, a little clumsy, full of energy, and unlikely to matter much in the grand picture, the Keth called humans brief ones because of their short lifespans. The Keth themselves lived for thousands of years and found it almost sad to look at a human face. And knowing it would be gone so fast, the Sarathi called them the loud little builders, not an insult exactly, but not a compliment either, and the Varrak Dominion simply did not think about humans at all. The Varrak were different from most species in the Conclave. They were tall, scaled, cold-eyed, and they had spent the last 4 centuries doing one thing very well, taking what did not belong to them. They did it carefully at first, moving into unclaimed systems, building outposts on the edges of weak civilizations, then slowly, quietly pushing those civilizations out, absorbing their people as labor, their resources as fuel, and their land as territory. The Conclave had passed resolutions about it. 12 resolutions in 60 years, each one worded more firmly than the last, and each one ignored by the Varrak, who had learned that the Conclave's words meant very little when no one was willing to back them with action. The Varrak had studied power carefully, and power, they believed, was the only thing that was real. The Yeethians were not powerful. They were a small species, bioluminescent and gentle, who glowed softly in the dark and spent most of their civilization's energy on music, art, and a deep philosophical tradition that had taken them 10,000 years to build. They lived in a solar system that sat at the edge of human-colonized space, and over the decades of contact, humans and Yeethians had built something genuine between them. Not just trade, but friendship, cultural exchange, a shared warmth that did not need a treaty to exist. Human children on the nearby colony worlds grew up listening to Yeethian music, which was built on frequencies that made the human chest feel full in a way that was hard to explain. The Yeethians in turn loved human food, human stories, and the particular human habit of laughing loudly at things that were not even that funny. It was a small, quiet relationship between two small, quiet peoples, and the Varrak ended it on a Tuesday. The attack was not a military engagement in any traditional sense. It was a demonstration. The Varrak High Command had decided that the unclaimed buffer systems near Yeethian space were strategically valuable, and the Yeethians were in the way, not as a threat, not as a rival, but simply as an obstacle. The way a small house is an obstacle when someone wants to build a road. They sent 3 fleets, far more than necessary, and they broadcast everything on open conclave frequencies because the point was not just to destroy the Yeethians, but to show everyone else what happened to small species who stood where the Varrak wanted to stand. The first city burned in 20 minutes. It was a coastal city, full of towers that glowed blue-green at night, and the Varrak ships turned it into glass and ash before anyone on the ground had time to run. The second city lasted longer, not because anyone defended it, but because the Varrak took their time. Refugee ships launched from the surface, hundreds of small vessels packed with terrified families, rising through smoke toward open space, and the Varrak picked them apart one by one, systematically, broadcasting every kill, because this was the message: there is no running, there is no mercy. There is no one coming to help you. The human cargo freighter CSV Marin's Hope was 3 hours out from the Yeethian system when the broadcast started coming through. Captain Dara Naji was in the middle of a routine supply run, her crew of 11 moving through the standard rhythms of a working ship when the screens filled with fire. Nobody spoke for a long moment. They just watched. Then First Officer Toby Asante said, quietly, "Say we're the closest ship in range." Dara did not hesitate. She turned the Marin's Hope around and pushed the engines to maximum. They could not fight a Varrak fleet. They knew that. But they could move fast, and they could move small. And in the chaos of a massacre, small and fast sometimes finds the gaps that big and powerful misses. It cost them 4 hours of desperate maneuvering through debris and burning wreckage, 2 hull breaches from proximity damage, and 1 crew member with a broken arm from a hard emergency dodge. But when the Marin's Hope finally broke away from the Yeethian system and punched into faster-than-light travel, she carried 47 Yeethian survivors in her cargo hold. Wrapped in every blanket and thermal sheet the crew owned, Dara sat in the pilot's seat after the jump was made, hands still on the controls, and she realized her hands were shaking. She made herself breathe slowly, and then she opened a channel and began recording the distress signal that would carry everything: the footage, the coordinates, the names of the dead, the faces of the 47 who were alive, and a message to Earth in plain, clear language. This happened. Everyone saw it and nobody stopped it. We need you to see it too. The message reached Earth on a Wednesday morning. It was played in full in the Parliament chamber. With every representative present, the footage ran for 31 minutes, and the chamber was completely silent for all of it. When it ended, the speaker asked if anyone wished to call for a period of review before voting. No one did. The vote was unanimous, and it passed in 4 minutes. The fastest vote in United Earth Parliament history. Outside the chamber, in the hallways and the offices and the monitoring stations, the staff who had watched the broadcast on their screens sat quietly, or stood in small groups, or stared at walls. And in the faces of every one of them was the same expression that did not have a simple name. It was not anger exactly. Anger was too hot and too simple for what sat in human faces that morning. It was something older, something that had been shaped by thousands of years of human history. The specific, quiet, iron feeling of a species that had spent centuries learning what it meant to be helpless, and had decided, long ago, in never to be helpless again. The galaxy did not know what had just started, but it was about to find out #the wrong species was woken by alien war crimes, #, part 2. What sleeps in the museums? The news of the Yeethian massacre moved through the galactic conclave like a slow fire. Everyone saw it, everyone said something, and then nothing happened. The Sarathi issued a formal statement calling the attack deeply troubling. The Keth ambassador walked out of the conclave session in protest, and then walked back in 2 hours later. The smaller species said nothing publicly because they had learned a long time ago that saying something only made the Varrak notice you. The Varrak representative to the conclave, a tall, cold-eyed soldier named High Delegate Vos Tirak, stood on the conclave floor and spoke for 40 minutes about sovereign military operations, buffer zone security, and the legal definitions of engagement under Articles 7 through 19 of the conclave charter. It was a very boring speech, and it was designed to be boring because boring speeches were how the Varrak had always turned war crimes into paperwork. 3 weeks passed, then 4, and the conclave voted on Resolution 43, which condemned the Yeethian attack in the strongest possible language and called for a committee to review the evidence and present recommendations within 90 days. The Varrak delegate voted against it. Every other species voted for it, and then everyone went home and nothing changed, except in one place on Earth. And things moved very differently, Ambassador Soth Kareel of the Varrak Dominion had served in many postings across the galaxy. He had visited the great ringed cities of the Sarathi, the deep ocean platforms of the Miru, the desert fortresses of the Seth, and in all of those places he had always felt the comfortable certainty that the Varrak were the strongest power in any room. Earth made him feel something different. He had been summoned there officially, a diplomatic formality, in the kind of meeting that preceded a formal human withdrawal from conclave proceedings. And he had prepared a speech about proportionality, about the realities of galactic politics, about how small species sometimes made choices that led to unfortunate outcomes. He never gave the speech, because 3 days before the meeting was scheduled, his diplomatic transport was given permission to pass through the outer human colony belt on the way to Earth, a routine path, slightly longer than the direct route offered as a courtesy. It was not a courtesy, it was a message. For 6 hours, Soth Kareel sat at the viewport of his ship and watched what the human outer belt actually contained. Not the trading posts and science stations that appeared on conclave maps, but shipyards, enormous ones, running on full power, then humming with construction on a scale that did not make sense for a species that had called itself a peaceful trading civilization. He counted the hull frames of 11 warships in a single pass of one station. Not small patrol vessels, but heavy battle carriers. Are their frames already thick with weapon mount points and armor plating that was dense enough to make a Varrak engineer nervous? He passed 3 more stations before the route brought him to open space again. He sat very still for a long time after that. When he arrived on Earth, the meeting was held in a large plain room with no decorations and very good lighting. The human representatives sat across the table from him, and they were polite, well-dressed, and completely calm in a way that Soth Kareel found more unsettling than anger would have been. The lead representative, a woman named Director Amara Cole, placed a single data card on the table between them and did not touch it again for the entire meeting. She did not raise her voice once. She explained, clearly and without emotion, that humanity was withdrawing from the Galactic Conclave effective immediately, that all human diplomatic missions to Varrak-aligned worlds were being recalled, that all trade agreements with the Varrak Dominion were canceled, and that humanity was formally declassifying its military capabilities registry for open conclave record. Then she picked up the data card and slid it across the table to him. "That is our statement to the Dominion," she said. "We would like you to deliver it personally." Soth Kareel looked at the card, but did not pick it up. "What does it say?" he asked. "It says that what you did to the Yeethians has a consequence," she answered, "and that the consequence has a name." He picked up the card. He read it on his ship that night, alone, and when he was done, he sat in the dark for a very long time. Then he sent a private encrypted message to the Varrak High Command that said only, "We have miscalculated. Request immediate strategic review." The High Command received the message the next morning. One of the senior commanders read it, showed it to 2 colleagues, and all 3 of them laughed. Their analysts ran projections on the human military capacity based on publicly available conclave data. The projections suggested a conflict would last 11 days at most, ending in a Varrak victory. They approved the counter-declaration the same afternoon. They did not know about the shipyards in the outer belt. The conclave maps were 80 years out of date, back on Earth. The mobilization was already underway. It did not look like what the galaxy would have expected war preparations to look like. There were no parades, no speeches from balconies, no dramatic ceremonies. There were instead long lines of cargo containers moving through automated port systems, coded manifests moving through secured channels, and millions of people quietly doing the jobs that needed doing. Humans had been at war with each other for most of their history. It was not something they were proud of exactly, but it had left behind something useful, a civilization that knew, at the cellular level, how to convert peacetime industry into wartime production without missing a beat. Factories that made agricultural equipment began running new specifications overnight. Shipping lanes that had carried food and medicine shifted to carry something heavier. Research stations that had been studying deep space phenomena turned their attention to more immediate targets. Admiral Yara Osei was appointed Supreme Commander of the Expeditionary Response. She was 53 years old, quiet, precise, and had spent her entire career studying conflict. Not just human conflict, but every recorded war in conclave history, every campaign the Varrak had ever run, every pattern of behavior they repeated because it had always worked before she spent her first week in command, not looking at weapons or ships but reading the files on every species the Varrak had ever conquered. She read the testimonies, the survivor accounts, the economic records, with the cultural histories of peoples who no longer existed as free civilizations. When she was done, she called her senior staff together and told them 3 things. "We are not going to fight the way they expect," she said. "We are not going to fight the way the conclave fights. We are going to fight the way this situation deserves to be fought. And we are going to win so completely that no one in this galaxy ever looks at a small species and sees an easy target again." Her staff was quiet for a moment. Then Commander Ife Bello, her chief strategist, asked, "What's our timeline?" Osei looked at the star maps spread across the wall. "They gave us 11 days, she said. "Let's see how they feel about that." In the Varrak capital, and High Commander Drethvas reviewed the human declaration one final time and set it aside. It was a small document, short and direct, and he found it almost amusing in its confidence. He had built his career on reading opponents, on understanding the difference between a civilization that was willing to fight and a civilization that only thought it was willing. And humans, he had always believed, were the second kind. Brave in small moments, emotional, reactive, but ultimately inexperienced in the kind of sustained industrial warfare that the Varrak had been perfecting for 4 centuries. "They are shopkeepers who found a sword," he told his staff, "and a shopkeeper with a sword is still a shopkeeper." His staff nodded and wrote down the quote because they thought it was the kind of thing that would look good in a history record. None of them would be writing history records in 11 days. What they would be doing in 11 days. He had on humanity was a very carefully managed lie that had been sitting in conclave records for 80 years, waiting for exactly this moment to stop being a lie and start being a weapon. The galaxy was watching, and it had no idea what it was about to see. #the wrong species was woken by alien war crimes. ## part 3. 11 days. The Varrak had a very specific way of starting wars. They announced their intentions through the proper conclave channels, designated a primary engagement zone, and then met the opposing fleet there in a formal confrontation that was almost ceremonial in its structure. It was how every conflict in the conclave era was fought. 2 sides faced each other in an agreed location that tested strength, and the weaker side eventually signaled surrender. It was orderly, predictable, and it kept wars from spreading too wide or lasting too long. Humanity did not show up to the designated engagement zone. The Varrak fleet waited at the coordinates for 18 hours. Admiral Vos Kren, commanding the First Strike Armada, sent increasingly frustrated communication demands to the human military command, each one going unanswered. His ships held formation, their weapons hot. They're staring at an empty stretch of space. Meanwhile, 6 separate human strike teams were already inside Varrak territory. They had not gone through the front door. They had gone through every other door, supply lanes, maintenance corridors of space station networks, though the quiet gaps between patrol routes that the Varrak had not bothered to update in 30 years because nobody had ever bothered to look for them before. The first target was the Varrak's primary fuel depot in the outer systems. It burned for 11 hours and took with it the reserves for 2 full Varrak battle fleets. There was no battle, No warning, no formal declaration. A human team of 40 people hit it fast, hit it precisely, and were gone before the alarm had fully processed. The second target was the Varrak Command Relay Network, 3 nodes, carefully selected, whose loss meant that Varrak fleet commanders in the border regions could no longer communicate with Central Command in real time. They were not destroyed exactly, just made unreliable, which was worse than destruction, because unreliable information is more dangerous than no information at all. The third target was something the Varrak did not expect anyone to know about: the full list of their embedded informants inside conclave neutral species. Admiral Osei had found the network 6 months before the war started, while it was still technically peacetime, and she had sat on the information quietly. Now she released it all at once, publicly, and to every conclave species simultaneously. The political damage was instant and severe. 3 neutral species who had been quietly feeding the Varrak information were suddenly facing their own populations in crisis, and 2 of them immediately cut all ties with the Dominion to try to contain the fallout. By day 3, Admiral Voss Kren finally understood that he was not waiting for a battle. He was already in one. He pulled his fleet out of the engagement zone and began trying to respond to the damage, which was exactly what Osei had wanted him to do. A reactive fleet is not a threatening fleet, and a commander responding to problems cannot be planning his own attack. As Varrak ships moved to protect their logistics chains, pulling forces back from their border systems, the subject peoples living under Varrak occupation began to stir. Osei had sent human diplomatic teams into those systems weeks earlier, in small ships carrying no weapons, only food, medical supplies, communication equipment, and a simple message. Humanity was coming, and anyone who wanted safe passage out of Varrak space should signal on a specific channel on day 4. But that channel lit up like a star. The Yeethian labor colonies, enslaved for 60 years, began moving toward the pre-arranged coordinates in whatever ships they could find or steal. Osei had 3 transport fleets waiting for them, heavily armed, and the Varrak commanders in those systems faced a choice: attack the escaping workers and give humanity a second massacre to broadcast to the galaxy, or let them go and lose half their workforce overnight. Most of them let them go, which was the right answer, but it still cost the Varrak everything those workers had been building and maintaining. Day 7 brought the first major fleet engagement, and it was nothing like what the Varrak had planned for. They had expected a straight fight. Their fleet was larger, better armored, and crewed by soldiers who had been doing this for generations. What they got instead was a human fleet that did not behave like a single unit, that split into dozens of smaller groups attacking from different angles simultaneously, that retreated when pressed and came back from directions no formation model had predicted. The Varrak had a name for this kind of warfare in their historical texts. They called it chaos fighting, and they considered it dishonorable. The tactic of a species that did not have the strength to stand and face an opponent properly, Osei called it efficiency. She had studied every Varrak engagement ever recorded, and she had noticed one consistent pattern. They were excellent at meeting force with force, and very bad at dealing with problems they could not see clearly. So she made sure they could never see clearly. Her pilots were trained for independent action. Each ship commander knew the objective, knew the fallback options, and was authorized to make decisions without waiting for orders. Against a Varrak command structure that required central approval for every major move, this meant that human forces could adapt 10 times faster than anything the Varrak could respond to. By day 9, the Varrak had lost 6 border systems, 2 fleet admirals, their primary fuel network, their intelligence operation, and roughly 40% of their available border forces. Their subject species were in open revolt, and their supply chains were bleeding, and their central command was receiving reports so contradictory that they could not build an accurate picture of their own situation. On day 10, High Commander Dreth Voss sent a formal ceasefire request through the Conclave emergency channel. He used the correct language, the proper forms, the careful phrasing that in every previous conflict had opened negotiations and let both sides step back from the edge, Admiral Osei received the request, read it once, and dictated her response in 2 seconds. Too late. Day 11 came and went. The Varrak analysts who had projected a human defeat on that date were not in the room anymore. They had been quietly reassigned because no one in the high command wanted to look at them. The war was not over, but it was no longer a question of whether the Varrak could win. The only question now was how deep this would go. On the human colony worlds, people watched the news feeds carefully. I'm proud and frightened in equal measure. War was not clean or simple, even when you were winning. 17 human soldiers had died in the First Fleet engagement, and their names were read aloud on every broadcast before the tactical updates were given. People wrote the names down, not because they were asked to, but because it felt like the right thing to do. Because this war had started because of names being forgotten, and humanity had decided, in the bone-deep way it decided things, that it was not going to be a civilization that forgot names. On the Yeethian refugee settlement on Colony 7, Elder Sarah Veen sat outside her shelter in the evening and watched the stars the way she had always watched them. The human children from the nearby residential blocks came and sat near her the way they always did, drawn to her quiet the way children are drawn to things they sense but cannot name one of them, a boy named Kemi. I'd asked her if she was scared. She thought about it honestly. I am many things, she said, but I have stopped being afraid. They showed us everything they were willing to do, and now the universe is showing them what that costs. I think that is the right order of things. Kemi nodded, like he understood. Which maybe he did. He was 9 years old and had watched the same footage as everyone else. Are the humans going to be okay? He asked. Sarah then looked at the stars for a long moment. Some of them will not be, she said, because she believed children deserved honest answers. And that is a true and painful thing. But the ones who come back will carry something with them that does not go away, which is the knowledge that they did not look away when it mattered. Kemi sat quietly with that for a while. The stars were very bright that night, and somewhere out in the dark between them, human ships were moving fast, and the Varrak were learning what it costs to wake up the wrong species number. The wrong species was woken by alien war crimes. Part 4, The Reckoning Has a Name. The Varrak capital world was called Vreth Khan. It sat at the center of the Dominion like a fist, ringed by defense platforms and surrounded by the permanent presence of 6 full battle fleets, because the Varrak High Command had built their civilization on the belief that strength at the center was the answer to every threat. It had always been enough before, it was not enough now. Human forces did not charge at Vreth Khan directly. Osei was not interested in a heroic assault against a fortified position when there were better ways to accomplish the same goal. Instead, she did something the Varrak had genuinely never anticipated from any opponent. She talked to everyone else. Not to the conclave, which was still in emergency session trying to pass a resolution about the previous resolution, but to the actual peoples inside Varrak space, the conquered civilizations, the labor colonies, the client species who had been told for generations that the Varrak were eternal and resistance was pointless. Human ships moved through the outer dominion like water, broadcasting on every frequency, not military signals but history, the full archive of Varrak war crimes going back 200 years. Crimes the conclave had recorded and then sealed because no one wanted the diplomatic inconvenience of dealing with them honestly. The Bari people had been absorbed by the Varrak 90 years ago. They had been a spacefaring civilization, scientists and builders, and the Varrak had stripped them of their ships and their weapons and set them to work mining asteroid fields. When the broadcast reached the Bari workers on the Keth 7 belt, they stopped working within 4 hours. Not dramatically, not with weapons, just stopped, sat down, and refused to move. The Varrak overseers threatened them. The workers looked at the human ships visible on the long-range scanners and stayed sitting. It happened again in the Leth system, then the Orvan Belt, and then the inner colony ring around the Varrak's third expansion world, the Dominion's economy, which ran on the forced labor of conquered peoples, began shutting down piece by piece, not from any military strike, but from millions of individual acts of refusal. The Varrak had built an empire on the assumption that the people inside it were broken, and they had been for a long time. But broken things can be unbroken when something shifts, and what had shifted was the knowledge, all broadcast on every channel, that there was somewhere to go and someone willing to help you get there. The Galactic Conclave was watching all of this with an expression that, if it had been on a single face, would have looked something like shame. Several of the older species had known about the sealed war crimes archive, had known for decades, and had made a quiet calculation that engaging the Varrak was more trouble than the alternative, which was looking away and writing resolutions. Watching humanity tear the galaxy open and show everyone what was inside was deeply uncomfortable for them. The Sarathi ambassador, honored Speaker Velthari, had been in conclave politics for over a century. She was old enough to remember when the first Yeethian cultural exchange ships had visited Sarathi space, full of glowing, gentle beings who gave gifts and asked for nothing. She had voted for every resolution, signed every condemnation, and then watched nothing happen, and she had told herself this was realism, this was how the galaxy worked. She asked for a private channel to Admiral Osei on the 42nd day of the war. "What do you need from us?" she asked. Osei was quiet for a moment. "Two things," she said. "Judicial observers for what comes after, and an honest answer to one question." "What question?" "Did you know about the archive?" Another silence, longer. "Yes," Velthari said. "Then I need you to carry that," Osei said, "because we are going to hold a tribunal and the galaxy is going to see everything in those files. And every species that knew and said nothing is going to have to look at what that silence cost. I am not asking you to be punished. I am asking you to stand in that room and not look away this time." Velthari agreed. It was, she would later write in her memoirs, the most difficult thing she had ever agreed to, and the most necessary. The tribunal was formally convened on day 56 of the war. It was held aboard the human command carrier UES Endurance, and it was open to any conclave observer species who wished to send representatives. 22 species sent observers, more than Osei had expected. The lead witness was Elder Sarah Veen, who had traveled from Colony 7 aboard a human diplomatic ship. She wore the traditional light weave of Yeethian formal ceremony, which pulsed gently in soft blues and greens, and she walked into the tribunal chamber without being led or guided, because she had asked to walk in alone. She spoke for 3 hours, not screaming, not collapsing, not performing grief for anyone's comfort. She spoke clearly and in detail about what had happened to her people, naming the cities that had existed, the people she had known personally, the specific things that had been lost that could never be rebuilt, and also the 47 who were alive, and what it had meant to be carried in the cargo hold of a human freighter wrapped in borrowed blankets. When she was done, the room was completely still. Then the evidence archive was opened, document by document, system by system, crime by crime. 2 centuries of what the Varrak had done and the galaxy had seen and recorded and then quietly filed away. Some of the observers wept. Some of them sat rigid, stone-faced. In the way of people who are feeling too much to show anything, one delegation from a small border species stood up in the middle of the proceedings, walked to the front of the room, and formally requested that their world's testimony be added to the record because the Varrak had done the same things to them 40 years ago and no one had listened. Then Osei added it to the record. On day 71, and the Varrak High Command attempted their final move. High Commander Dreth Vas broadcast a direct message to Admiral Osei. Withdraw all human forces from Varrak space within 48 hours, or the High Command would order the orbital bombardment of 3 subject worlds, civilian worlds, and millions of people, as punishment for the labor uprisings. It was the kind of threat that had worked before, the kind of threat that made other species calculate lives against political costs and find a compromise. Osei's response took 4 minutes to arrive, and because it was not a message, it was an action. 17 human stealth ships that had been sitting silent inside Varrak inner space for 11 days moved simultaneously. They hit the communication infrastructure of the High Command Center so precisely and so fast that the bombardment order was never transmitted. 3 High Commanders were captured in the following hour, and then Dreth Vas himself was taken alive by a boarding team as he reached for an evacuation pod. The 3 worlds were never touched. That night, Osei sat alone in her cabin for a long time. She did not feel triumphant. She had learned early in her career that the feeling people expected commanders to feel after a success was not what she ever actually felt, which was a kind of heavy, specific tiredness that was not exhaustion exactly, but the weight of knowing exactly what things had cost. She thought about the 17 soldiers who had died in the first fleet engagement, and the 31 who had died since. She thought about their faces in the briefing files. They're the way personnel files always gave you a photograph and a name and a list of qualifications that somehow never captured the actual person. Then she opened a blank document and began writing. She wrote a personal letter to the family of every human soldier who had died in the campaign. She wrote each one individually, by hand, because she believed that was the minimum they deserved, and because she had always believed that a commander who was not willing to do the hard, slow, and personal work of grief had no business sending people into danger. She was still writing when the sun came up over the observation deck. The war was almost over, but the reckoning was just beginning, and she intended to see every part of it through #TheWrongSpecies, was woken by alien war crimes, #Part 5, the price of being noticed. The war ended on the 89th day, and it ended quietly. There was no ceremony, no surrender stage. No dramatic final battle. The Varrak Dominion simply stopped being able to function, like a very large machine whose essential parts had all been removed one by one, carefully, until nothing was left that could move. The last Varrak battle fleet stood down in the outer systems without firing another shot. Its commander sent a formal surrender to the nearest human vessel, a supply ship, which then had to relay it urgently up the chain because the actual combat command had already moved on to the next problem. Dreth Vas signed the formal dissolution documents in the tribunal chamber aboard the UES Endurance. He sat across the table from Elder Saravine, which was Osei's deliberate choice, and because she believed that the person who had the most right to witness that signature was the last elder of the Yeethian generation that had survived the massacre, Dreth Vas did not look at Saravine during the signing. Saravine watched him with complete attention, and her expression was not angry. It was simply present, fully present, the face of someone who had decided to see clearly and remember everything. When it was done, she said nothing to him. She turned and walked out of the chamber, and Osei fell into step beside her in the corridor outside. "How do you feel?" Osei asked. "Like it is finally possible to grieve properly," Saravine said. "Before this I could not. The emergency was too large, but now it can be what it is." They walked together in silence for a while, which was enough. The Galactic Conclave reconvened in full session 30 days after the war's end. It was the most attended session in 300 years, with delegations from species that had not sent representatives in decades, some because they had been too afraid of Varrak influence to participate freely, and some because they had simply needed to see what had happened with their own eyes before they could believe it. Humanity returned as well, represented by director Amara Cole, who had aged 5 years in the 2 years since she had last sat in this chamber. She sat down at the human delegation's table with the same calm she had shown when she slid a data card across a table to a Varrak ambassador, and she waited for the session to begin. She presented humanity's proposal in plain language without drama. The galaxy needed an actual enforcement mechanism. Not resolutions, not condemnations, not committees that met for 90 days and produced recommendations that no one followed, but an agreed body with the authority to act when war crimes occurred, backed by a coalition of species willing to provide real enforcement with real power behind it. The proposal included the full Varrak archive, permanently unsealed and made public record. It included provisions for the resettlement and reparation of every people the Varrak had conquered, and it included a mechanism by which any species, no matter how small, could formally call for protection and receive a response within days instead of decades. 22 species signed that day, more signed in the following weeks. Several of the older, larger species resisted, uncomfortable with the binding nature of the commitment. Too comfortable with the old way that had kept them safe by keeping them uninvolved. Cole did not argue with them. She noted their positions for the record and moved on. "We are not asking for perfection," she told the chamber. "We are asking for the next step. The galaxy has been taking the same step for 300 years and going in a circle. This is a different direction. The Varrak subject worlds were placed under a transition administration jointly managed by volunteer conclave species and human advisors. The process was slow and imperfect and sometimes contentious, but because rebuilding a civilization that had been deliberately dismantled over generations was not something that happened fast or cleanly. The Bari scientists who had been mining asteroid fields for 90 years were given back their old research data from the sealed conclave archives. The first thing many of them did with it was teach it to their children, who had grown up knowing only the minds one Bari woman named Kos, who was 64 years old and had been born in a labor camp, that stood in the first classroom her people had been permitted to run in 6 decades and looked at 30 young faces looking back at her. She did not have a speech prepared because she had not believed this moment would come in her lifetime. So she simply said, "We start from here," and began. Back on Earth, the return of the soldiers was not simple. Some came home to parades, which they tolerated. Some came home quietly, which they preferred. All of them came home carrying things that did not show up on any medical scan, but were real nonetheless. The particular weight of people who have done hard things in hard places and now have to learn how to put that weight down without dropping it on the people they love. There were programs for it, and counselors, and communities of veterans who understood each other in ways that others did not. It was not perfect, but it was there. Because humanity had learned through centuries of its own wars that the cost of fighting does not end when the fighting does, and had built systems around that knowledge. The 17 soldiers who had died in the First Fleet engagement were buried on a hill outside the capital, in a section of a cemetery that had held human soldiers for 400 years. Their names were carved into the shared memorial alongside the names of every other human who had died in the campaign. And people came to read the names the way people have always come to read the names of the dead. Slowly, quietly, as a way of saying that the names are not forgotten. Colony 7, where the Yeethian refugees had lived for 2 years, began to empty out as families packed their belongings and boarded the resettlement ships. Humanity had committed resources to the terraforming of Yeethian-compatible worlds in the recovered territory. Then and the first of those worlds was ready enough to receive settlers. The last family to leave was Elder Sarah Veen's household. She had chosen to go last as a deliberate act, because she wanted to walk through the settlement after everyone else had gone and remember what it had looked like when it was full. She did not rush. She walked slowly through the empty corridors and the spaces that had been meeting rooms and kitchens and children's play areas. And she let herself feel all of it. The grief, the gratitude, the strangeness of being alive when so many were not, and the particular tenderness she felt toward this human colony that had held her people in its arms while they had nowhere else to go. A young human crew member named Dio was waiting at the dock to help with the last loading. He was 19, assigned to logistics, and he had grown up on Colony 7, and which meant he had known the Yeethian settlement his entire life. He had played with Yeethian children as a boy, learned 3 words of the Yeethian tonal language from the neighbors next door, and eaten Yeethian spiced food at community gatherings without ever thinking it was unusual. He was carrying a box for Saravin when he stopped and asked the question that had been sitting in him for a long time. Why do you think they did it? The Varrak. I mean, why would anyone do what they did? Saravin set down what she was carrying and considered this seriously, because she always considered questions seriously, because they believed power was the only real thing, she said, and when you believe that, other people stop being real to you. They become objects, obstacles, and numbers, and once that happens, there is no limit to what you will do. Dio was quiet for a moment. Do you think it can happen again? Somewhere else? Yes, she said, simply and without cruelty, which is why what happened after matters more than what happened during. Anyone can be stopped by force. What is harder and more important is building something that makes it less likely next time. That is what your people started. I do not know if they will finish it, but they started it, and that is not nothing. He nodded slowly and picked up the box again, and they walked together to the ship. The resettlement ship launched on a clear morning, and Colony 7 went quiet behind it. The new world waited in the recovered territory, growing slowly greener under human-assisted skies, and the Yeethian ships came down through the atmosphere in long, careful lines, and the people inside them looked out the viewports at land that was theirs again, and felt something that had no single word in any language, but was understood by every living thing that has ever come home after being told it never would. Far away in the conclave chamber, the long work of building something better continued, imperfect, contested, slow, and real, the way all important things are. And in the dark between the stars, 47 names were still alive and growing into more. The galaxy was a very old and crowded place, but it was, just slightly, better than it had been before. And that was where it started. It always starts there, in the small gap between what is and what should be, where someone decided not to look away.